By 2030, these 5 armies will be truly unstoppable. Since the end of the Cold War, ground combat operations have become much more focused. Nowadays, relatively few operations result in the acquisition or liberation of land by the defeat of a force that is comparable in terms of technology and doctrine. While planning for these missions is still crucial, ground combat branches have many other goals as well, some of which date back to the early days of the modern military, such as counterinsurgency and policing. In 2030, following the wars on terror and the wars of Russian reconsolidation, how will the balance of ground combat strength be shaped? Forecasts are difficult, particularly when they concern the future, but a few straightforward inquiries might clarify our thinking. This video is specifically motivated by 3 questions. Does the Army have access to resources available to the country, such as cutting-edge technology? Is the Army receiving enough political support without sacrificing its autonomy as an organization? Does the Army have access to hands-on training and opportunities for learning and innovation in real-world settings? With maybe a few significant modifications, the majority of ground combat forces in 2030 will likely resemble the most deadly forces in existence today in light of these questions. Number 5. India. The Indian Army is prepared to fight with the best ground combat units in the world. The Army has engaged in military operations of varying intensities, including fighting a domestic Maoist insurgency, an insurgency in Kashmir that is sponsored by Pakistan, and several other minor internal operations. However, the Indian Army has long recognized the necessity of realistic combat training and is still well equipped for high-stakes engagements with Pakistan. All things considered, these encounters have refined the force into a useful instrument for New Delhi's international and internal policies. Even though the Indian Army's equipment has significantly trailed behind rivals, India today has access to almost all military technologies. India purchases goods from Russia, Europe, Israel, and the US, which supports the expansion of the country's military-industrial complex. The Indian Army should have more access to cutting-edge technology in the future than it has in the past, making it an even more potent force, even though it must compete with the air and naval services. Number 4. France. France will probably continue to have the most proficient and deadly army among all the European nations in the future. France is steadfast in its belief that it must have strong ground forces to maintain its position as a key player in international politics. As France gains more authority over the EU's military and security apparatus, this should continue and maybe pick in speed in the future. The military-industrial complex in France is still strong, both in terms of exports and domestic sales. Equipped with cutting-edge command and communications technology, the Army serves as the core of the majority of multilateral forces inside the European Union. It also has access to top-notch field tools, such as artillery and tanks. The Army benefits from the French government's dedication to preserving a robust domestic armament sector. The low to middle arcs of the combat spectrum are areas in which the French Army has a great deal of operational experience. It has participated in the wars on terror in Afghanistan and North Africa, where it has supported locals and defeated enemy irregulars with both regular and elite soldiers. The Army also has the backing of the 2 other French services. The Air Force has been concentrating more on support operations, such as transport, reconnaissance, and battlefield strike, while the Marine Nationale has impressive expeditionary capabilities. The Army is readily deployable throughout a broad range of regions due to its professional modular structure. Number 3. Russia. The end of the Cold War brought about a traumatic shift for the Russian Army, which saw a significant loss of manpower, political clout, and resource access. With the steady disintegration of the military-industrial complex that had backed the Red Army, the force was left with antiquated and badly maintained weaponry. The Army suffered in warfare against irregulars in Chechnya and other areas, and morale declined. While some things have changed, not everything has. Increased investment in the force was made possible by improvements in the Russian economy. Russia's victory in the Chechen War was aided by reform, particularly in the elite forces. The Russian army swiftly overthrew Georgia in 2008, and it led the charge to wrest Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. Collectively, this could be referred to as the Russian Reconsolidation Wars, a conflict that may not have concluded yet. Despite giving up some territory to the air and naval forces in recent years, the Russian army remains the main power behind Moscow's governance of the near abroad. In 2030, the Russian army will still be a deadly force, but it will also face significant challenges. In the future, technology access might become a bigger issue. The Soviet military-industrial complex has now reached the end of its life, leaving behind a production and innovation system that has suffered on both sides of the issue. The army appears to be stuck between the volunteer system that makes elite forces so unique and the outdated conscription model, which is supported by a declining population, which could pose a problem for manpower. However, the Russian army's might and might will continue to be a source of concern for its neighbors for a very long time, particularly when it comes to so-called hybrid operations. Number 2, United States of America. Since at least 1991, the U.S. Army has stood for the epitome of a ground combat force. The two most remarkable achievements in ground warfare since the end of the Cold War are the destruction of the Iraqi army in 2003 and its defeat in 1991. The Army has maintained field operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. For the past 15 years, special operators have ventured considerably further afield. The U.S. Army still possesses a strong system of military innovation at its disposal. Its part of the pie is with the Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. But even with the last 10 years of slow development, the pie is still very big. Even while the U.S. Army still uses some technology from the Cold War, nearly all of it has undergone several improvements to meet the demands of contemporary, networked warfare. With the most extensive collection of reconnaissance drones in the world, the Army can link precise and deadly fires with forward observation. Furthermore, the Army has engaged in battle in the Wars on Terror for 15 years, which is the longest continuous stretch of combat operations since the Indian Wars at the very least. There are risks associated with this experience, not the least of which is organizational fatigue. This is especially troubling because it seems like the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq will never finish. Even however, the U.S. Army ought to hold a sizable lead over all other ground combat forces around the globe by 2030. Number 1. China. The People's Liberation Army has been thoroughly reforming its ground units since at least the early 1990s. Parts of the PLA guaranteed certain political groups inside the Chinese Communist Party for many years. With the implementation of reforms, the PLA grew to be both a military and a commercial entity, assuming control of numerous small businesses. With the explosion of the Chinese economy in the 1990s and 2000s, this situation started to change. The PLA's ground element started to restructure and become a more modern military force, as a result of financial availability and a growingly inventive technological industry. The PLA's ground force, like its American equivalent, has to split the financial spoils between two greedy partners. China has firmly ended the period in which it prioritized ground power above air and maritime power. Furthermore, the PLA will never be able to completely separate itself from the internal conflicts inside the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. They are too tightly linked for any sort of civil-military ties akin to those in the West to succeed. Reform has taken the shape of extensive equipment upgrade programs and practical training and moves toward the force's professionalization. The PLA has more resources than practically any other force in the world and almost limitless manpower, even though it does not receive the same level of funding as the U.S. forces. The PLA's one weakness is that it hasn't engaged in actual combat since the Sino-Vietnamese War, and it hasn't taken part in any of the major conflicts of this century. Nevertheless, There's no reason to think that the current tendencies in PLA reform and modernization will reverse course over the next 15 years. Did you like it? Tell us what you think of the video in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting videos.